We're going to read from Journey to the Center of the Earth, Chapter 6, Our Voyage to Iceland. The hour of departure came at last. The night before, the worthy Mr. Thompson brought us the most cordial letter of introduction from Baron Tramp, Governor of Iceland, for M. Picterson, co-adjudicator to the bishop, and for M. Finson, mayor of the town of Reykjavik. In return, my uncle nearly crushed his hands, so warmly did he shake them. On the 2nd of the month, at 2 in the morning, our precious cargo of luggage was taken on board the good ship Valkyrie. We followed, and were very politely introduced by the captain to a small cabin with 2 standing bed places, neither very well ventilated nor very comfortable. Excuse me. But in the cause of science, men are expected to suffer. Well, we have we a fair wind? Cried my uncle in his most mellifluous accent. An excellent wind, replied Captain Bjarn. We shall leave the Sound, going free with all sails set. A few minutes afterwards, the schooner started before the wind, under all the canvas she could carry, and entered the channel. An hour later, the captain of Denmark seemed to sink into the waves, and we were at no great distance from the coast of Eleanor. My uncle was delighted. For myself, moody and dissatisfied, I appeared almost to expect a glimpse of the ghost of Hamlet. Sublime madam, thought I, you doubtless would approve our proceedings. You might perhaps even follow us to the center of the earth, there to resolve your eternal doubts. But no ghost or anything else appeared upon the ancient walls. The fact is, the castle is much later than the time of the heroic Prince of Denmark. It is now the residence of the keeper of the Strait of the Sound. And though that sound more than 15,000 vessels of all nations pass every year, the castle of Kronborg soon disappeared in the murky atmosphere, as well as the town of Helsingborg, which raises its head in the Swedish bank. And here the schooner began to feel in earnest the breezes of the Kattegat. The Valkyrie was swift enough, but with all sailing boats, there is the same uncertainty. Her cargo was coal, furniture, pottery, woolen clothing, and a load of corn. As usual, the crew was small, 5 Danes going through the whole of the work. How long will the voyage last? Asked my uncle. Well, I should think about 10 days, replied the skipper, unless indeed we meet some northeast gales among the Faroe Islands. At all events, there will be no very considerable delay, cried the professor. No, Mr. Hardwigg, said the captain, no fear of that. At all events, we shall get there someday. Towards evening, the schooner doubled Cape Skagen, the northernmost part of Denmark, crossed the Skagerrak during the night, skirted the extreme port of Norway through the gut of Cape Lindesnes, and then reached the northern seas. 2 days later, we were not far from the coast of Scotland, somewhere near the Danish sailors called Peterhead. And then the Valkyrie stretched out direct for the Faroe Islands, between Orkney and Shetland. Our vessel now felt the full force of the ocean waves, and the wind shifting. We, with great difficulty, made the Faroe Isles. On the 8th day, the captain made out my gains, the westernmost of the isles, and from that moment headed direct for Portland, a cape on the southern shores of the singular island in which we were bound. The voyage offered no incident worthy of record. I bore it very well, but my uncle, to his great annoyance and even shame, was remarkably seasick. This mal-de-mer troubled him more than it prevented him from questioning Captain Bjarn as to the subject of Sneffels, as to the means of communication, and to the facilities of transport. All these explanations he had to adjourn to the period of his arrival. His time, meanwhile, was spent lying on the bed, groaning and dwelling anxiously on the hoped for termination of the voyage. I didn't pity him. On the 11th day, we sighted Cape Portland, over which towered Mount Myrdal's yokel, which, the weather being clear, we made out very readily. The cape itself is nothing but a huge mount of granite, standing naked and alone to meet the Atlantic waves. The Valkyrie kept off the coast, steering to the westward. On all sides were to be seen whole schools of whales and sharks. After some hours, we came in sight of a solitary rock in the ocean, forming a mighty vault, through which the foaming ocean, with foaming waves poured with intense fury. The island of Westman appeared to leap from the ocean, being so low in the water as scarcely to be seen until you were right upon them. From that moment, the schooner was steered to the westward in order to round the Cape Reykjanes, the western point of Iceland. My uncle, to his great disgust, was unable to even crawl on deck, so heavily a sea was on, and thus lost the first view of the land of promise. 48 hours later, after a storm which drove us far to sea under bare poles, we came once more in sight of the land, and were boarded by a pilot, who, after 3 hours of dangerous navigation, brought the schooner safely to an anchor in the Bay of Faxa before Reykjavik. My uncle came out of his cabin, pale, haggard, thin, but full of enthusiasm. His eyes were dilated with pleasure and satisfaction. Nearly the whole population of the town was on foot to see us land. The fact was that scarcely any one of them but expected some goods by the periodical vessel. Professor Hardwigg was in haste to leave his prison, or rather, as he called it, his hospital. But before he attempted to do so, he caught hold of my hand, led me to the quarterdeck of the schooner, took my arm with his left hand, and pointed inland to it with his right, over the northern part of the bay to where rose a high two-peaked mountain, a double cone covered with eternal snow. "Behold," he whispered, in an awe-stricken voice. Sorry, guys. I'm having trouble tonight. "Behold," he whispered in an awe-stricken voice. "Behold, Mount Sneffels." Then, without further remark, he put his finger to his lips, frowned darkly, and descended into the small boat which awaited us. I followed, and in a few minutes we stood upon the soil of mysterious Iceland. Scarcely were we fairly on shore when there appeared before us a man of excellent appearance, wearing the costume of a military officer. He was, however, but a civil servant, a magistrate, the governor of the island, Baron Tramp. The professor knew whom he had to deal with. He therefore handed him the letters from Copenhagen, and a brief conversation in Danish followed, to which I, of course, was a stranger, and for very good reason, for I did not know the language in which they conversed. I afterwards heard, however, that Baron Tramp placed himself entirely at the beck and call of Professor Hardwigg. My uncle was most graciously received by M. Finson, the mayor, who, as far as costume went, was quite as military as the governor, but also from chapter and occupation quite as specific. For his coadjutor, Mr. Picterson, he was absent on an episcopal visit to the northern portion of the diocese. We were therefore compelled to defer the pleasure of being presented to him. His absence was, however, more than compensated by the presence of Mr. Fredrickson, professor of natural history in the College of Reykjavik, a man of invaluable ability. This modest scholar spoke no languages save Icelandic and Latin. When, therefore, he addressed himself to me in the language of Horace, we at once came to understand one another. He was, in fact, the only person that I did thoroughly understand during the whole period of my residence on this benighted island. Out of 3 rooms of which his house was composed, 2 were placed at our service. and in a few hours we were installed with our baggage, the amount of which rather astonished simple inhabitants of Reykjavik. "Now, Harry," said my uncle, rubbing his hands, "and goes well. The worst discovery it's now over." How's the worst? How's the worst difficulty over? I cried with fresh amazement. "Doubtless, we are in Iceland. Nothing more remains but to descend into the bowels of the earth." Well, sir, to a certain extent you are right. We have only to go down, but as far as I am concerned, that is not the question. I want to know, how are we to get up again? "Ah, that is the least part of the business, and does not in any way trouble me. In the meantime, there is not an hour to lose. I am about to visit the public library. Very likely I may find there some manuscripts from the hand of Saknussemm. I shall be glad to consult them." In the meantime," I replied, "I will take a walk through the town. Will you not likewise do so?" "Ah, I feel no interest in the subject," said my uncle. "What for me is curious in the island is not what is about of the surface, but what is below." I bowed by way of reply, put on my hat and furred cloak, and went out. It was not an easy matter to lose oneself in the two streets of Reykjavik. I had therefore no need to ask my way. The town lies on a flat and marshy plain between two hills. A vast field of lava skirts it on one side, falling away in terraces towards the sea. On the other hand is a large bay of Faxa, bordered by the north by the enormous glacier of Sneffels, and in which bay the Valkyrie was then only vessel at anchor. Generally, there was one or two English or French gunboats to watch and protect the fisheries in the offing. They were now, however, absent on duty. The longest of the streets of Reykjavik runs parallel to the shore. In his street, the merchants and traders live in wooden huts made with beams of wood, painted red, mere log huts, such as you find in the wilds of America. The other street, situated more to the west, runs toward the little lake between the residences of the bishop and other personages not engaged in commerce. I had soon seen all I wanted of these weary and dismal thoroughfares. Here and there was a strip of discolored turf, like an old worn-out bit of wooden carpet, and now and then a bit of kitchen garden, in which grew potatoes, cabbage, and lettuce, almost diminutive enough to suggest the idea of Lilliput. In the center of the new commercial street, I found the public cemetery enclosed by the earthen wall. Though not very large, it appeared not likely to be filled for centuries. From hence I went to the house of the governor, a mere hut in the comparison with the mansion house of Hamburg, but a palace alongside the other Icelandic houses. Between the little lake and the town was the church, built in simple Protestant style and composed of calcined stones thrown up by volcanic action. I have not the slightest doubt that in high winds its red tiles were blown out, to the great annoyance of the pastor and congregation. Upon an eminence close, excuse me, oh no, upon an eminence close at hand was the national school in which were taught Hebrew, English, French, and Danish. In 3 hours, my tour was complete. The general impression upon my mind was sadness. No trees, no vegetation, so to speak. On all sides, volcanic peaks, the huts of turf and earth, more like roofs than houses. Thanks to the heat, these residences, grass grows on the roof, which grass is carefully cut for hay. I saw but few inhabitants during my excursion, but I met a crowd on the beach drying, salting, and loading codfish, the principal article of exportation. The men appeared robust but heavy, fair-haired like Germans, out of pensive mien, exiles of a higher scale in the ladder of humanity than Eskimos, but, I thought, more unhappy, since with superior perceptions they are compelled to live within the limits of the polar circle. Sometimes they gave vent to a convulsive laugh, but by no chance did they smile. Their costume consists of a coarse capote of black wool, known in Scandinavian countries as the vadmel, a broad-brimmed hat, trousers of red serge, and a piece of leather tied with strings for a shoe, a coarse kind of moccasin. The women, though sad-looking and mournful, had rather agreeable features, without much expression. They wear a bodice and petticoat of somber vadmel. When unmarried, they wear a little brown knitted cap over a crown of plaited hair. Chapter 7: Conversation and Discovery. When I returned, dinner was ready. This meal was devoured by my worthy relative with avidity and voracity. His shipboard diet had turned his interior into a perfect gulf. The repast, which was more Danish than Icelandic, was in itself nothing, but the excessive hospitality of our host made us enjoy it doubly. The conversation turned upon scientific matters, and M. Fridriksson asked my uncle what he thought of the public library. "Library, sir?" cried my uncle. "It appears to me a collection of useless odd volumes and a beggarly amount of empty shelves." "What?" cried M. Fridriksson. "Why, we have 8,000 volumes and most rare and valuable works, some in Scandinavian language, besides all the new publications from Copenhagen." 8,000 volumes, my dear sir. Why, where are they?" cried my uncle. "Scattered over the country, Professor Hardwigg. We are very studious, my dear sir, though we do live in Iceland. Every farmer, every laborer, every fisherman can both read and write. And we think that books, instead of being locked up in cupboards far from the sight of students, should be distributed as widely as possible. The books of our library are therefore passed from hand to hand without returning to the library shelves, perhaps for years." "Then when foreigners visit you, there is nothing for them to see?" "Well, sir, foreigners have their own libraries, and our first consideration is that our humbler classes should be highly educated. Fortunately, the love of study is innate in the Icelandic people. In 1816, we founded a literary society and mechanics institute. Many foreign scholars of eminence are honorary members. We published books destined to educate our people, and these books have rendered valuable services to our country. Allow me to have the honor, Professor Hardwigg, to enroll you as an honorary member." My uncle, who already belonged to nearly every literary and scientific institution in Europe, immediately yielded to the amiable wishes of good Mr. Fridriksson. "And now," he said, after many expressions of gratitude and goodwill, "if you tell me what books you expected to find, perhaps I may be of assistance to you." I watched my uncle keenly. For a minute or two, he hesitated, as if unwilling to speak. To speak openly was, perhaps, to unveil his projects. Nevertheless, after some reflection, he made up his mind. "Well, Mr. Fridriksson," he said in an easy, unconcerned kind of way, "I was desirous of ascertaining if, among other valuable works, you had any of the learned Arne Saknussemm." "Arne Saknussemm!" cried the professor of Reykjavik. "You speak of one of the most distinguished scholars of the 16th century, of the great naturalist, the great alchemist, the great traveler." "Exactly so. One of the most distinguished men connected with Icelandic science and literature, as you say, sir." "A man illustrious above all." "Yes, sir, all that is true, but his works?" "We have none of them." "Not in Iceland?" "There are none in Iceland or elsewhere," answered the other sadly. "Why so?" "Because Arne Saknussemm was persecuted for heresy, and in 1573 his works were publicly burnt at Copenhagen by the hands of common hangmen." "Very good, capital," murmured my uncle, to the great astonishment of the worthy Icelander. "You said, sir—" Yes, all is clear. I see the link in the chain. Everything is explained, and I now understand why Arne Saknussemm put out of court, forced to hide his magnificent discoveries, was compelled to conceal beneath the veil of an incomprehensible cryptograph the secret. What secret? A secret which have you discovered some wonderful manuscript? Cried M. Fredrickson. No, I was carried away by my enthusiasm. A mere supposition. Very good, sir. But really, to turn to another subject, I hope you will not leave our island without examining into its mineralogical riches. Well, the fact is, I am rather late. So many learned men have been here before me. Yes, but there is still much to be done, cried M. Fredrickson. You think so? Said my uncle, his eyes twinkling with hidden satisfaction. Yes, you have no idea how many unknown mountains, glaciers, volcanoes there are which remains to be studied. Without moving from where we sit, I can show you one. Yonder on the edge of the horizon, you see Sneffels. Oh, yes, Sneffels, said my uncle. One of the most curious volcanoes in existence, the crater of which has been rarely visited. Extinct? Extinct any time these 500 years, was the ready reply. Well, said my uncle, who dug his nails into his flesh and pressed his knees tightly together to prevent himself leaping up with joy, I have a great mind to begin my studies with an examination of the geological mysteries of this Mount Sneffel. Faisal, what did you call it? Sneffels, my dear sir. This portion of the conversation took place in Latin, and I therefore understood all that had been said. I could scarcely keep my countenance when I found my uncle so cunningly concealing his delight and satisfaction. I must confess that his artful grimaces, put on to conceal his happiness, made him look like a new Mephistopheles. Yes, he continued, your propositions delight me. I will endeavor to climb the summit of Sneffels, and if possible, will descend into its crater. I very much regret, continued Mr. Fredrickson, that my occupation will entirely preclude the possibility of my accompanying you. It would have been both pleasurable and profitable if I could have spared the time. No, 1,000 times no, cried my uncle. I do not wish to disturb the serenity of any man. Thank you, however, with all my heart. The presence of one so learned as yourself would no doubt have been most useful, but the duties of your office and profession before everything. In the innocence of his simple heart, our host did not perceive the irony of these remarks. I entirely approve your project, continued the Icelander, after some further remarks. It is a good idea to begin by examining this volcano. You will make a harvest of curious observations. In the first place, how do you propose to get to Sneffels? By sea. I shall cross the bay. Of course, that is the most rapid route. Of course, but still, it can't be done. Why? We have not an available boat in all of Reykjavik, replied the other. What is to be done? You must go by land along the coast. It is longer, but much more interesting. Then I must have a guide. Of course. I have your very man. Somebody on whom I can depend. Yes, an inhabitant of the peninsula on which Sneffels is situated. He is a very shrewd and worthy man, with whom you will be pleased. He speaks Danish like a Dane. When can I see him? Today? No, tomorrow. He will not be here before. Tomorrow be it, replied my uncle with a deep sigh. The conversation ended by compliments on both sides. During the dinner, my uncle had learned much as to the history of Arne Saknussemm, the reason for his mysterious and hieroglyphical document. He also became aware that his host would not accompany him on his adventurous expedition, and that next day we should have a guide. So next chapter is chapter 8, the Eiderdown Hunter off at last. But we are through for today.
All right.
What did y'all think?
Yeah,
All
we
right.
had a little Sean Connery come and visit us a little bit,
Yeah.
I think. There.
Yeah, I'm still working on the uncle's voice. It'll narrow into something eventually.
Oh, I liked it.
Let's
Uh,
see. We got in the comments today.
Julie said, "You're doing great. My 7-year-old son has a lot of questions about the wording, but is loving the story.
Awesome. Good. Good.
It's been fun
Good.
listening."
Look,
Explaining
Gladys is
to
on
him.
there. Sheldon says hi.
Yep.
Yeah.
So,
Awesome.
it's been awesome having you guys on this journey again.